Before we begin, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe and like the video. It really helps us share real history and bring important stories like this to more people. War does not begin with the first shot. It begins with silence, with decisions made behind closed doors, with armies moving while the world is still asleep. Before the names of battles were written into history, before cities turned to ruins and oceans became graveyards, the world stood on the edge, unaware of how close it was to collapse. This is not just a story of victories and defeats. It is the story of the moments that changed everything, of battles that reshaped nations, and of a war that redefined humanity itself. If you value deep history and stories that go beyond the surface, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps keep these stories alive. This is the story of World War II, the decisive battles of World War II. Part 1. When the world turned into a battlefield. The Second World War was not decided in a single moment or by a single battle. It was shaped by a series of brutal confrontations that stretched across continents, oceans, and years. Each major battle was more than a military clash. It was a turning point that changed strategies, morale, and the fate of millions. Together, these battles formed the backbone of the war, determining not only who would win, but how the modern world would be reshaped. The invasion that shocked the world. The war began with speed and shock. Armored columns moved faster than anyone expected, supported by aircraft that dominated the skies. Nations that believed they had time to prepare found themselves overwhelmed in weeks. The early battles demonstrated that modern warfare was no longer slow or predictable. Coordination between tanks, infantry, and air power created a new form of combat that traditional defenses could not stop. Cities fell rapidly. Governments collapsed. Refugees flooded roads, carrying what little they could save. These early victories reshaped Europe and sent a clear message. This war would be fast, ruthless, and unforgiving. The battle for the skies. As armies advanced on land, control of the air became essential. One of the first truly decisive struggles of the war was fought above cities, rather than on their streets. Aircraft clashed daily, not only to destroy enemy planes, but to break civilian morale. Bombing raids targeted factories, ports, and neighborhoods. Sirens became part of everyday life. Victory in the air meant survival on the ground. This battle proved that air power alone could decide the fate of nations, forcing governments to rethink defense, industry, and civilian protection. War spreads across the seas. The conflict soon expanded beyond Europe. Naval battles determined access to resources, supply routes, and entire regions. Massive fleets clashed across open oceans, where victory depended on intelligence, technology, and timing as much as firepower. Aircraft carriers replaced battleships as the dominant force. Submarines hunted silently beneath the waves, turning shipping lanes into deadly traps. Entire battles were decided without opposing ships ever seeing each other. Control of the seas became the foundation for every major campaign that followed. The Eastern Front. War without limits. No theater of the war matched the scale and brutality of the fighting in Eastern Europe. Here, battles were fought not only for territory, but for survival itself. Armies numbering in the millions collided across vast distances in extreme weather with little regard for human cost. Cities became symbols. Streets turned into killing zones. Buildings changed hands dozens of times. Soldiers fought room by room, often without food, warmth, or hope of rescue. This front consumed lives at a scale never seen before and became the decisive ground war of the conflict. A turning point in the ruins. One particular battle marked the moment when the momentum of the war shifted. What began as an offensive ended in encirclement, starvation, and collapse. An entire army was destroyed, proving that victory was no longer guaranteed for the aggressor. This battle shattered the myth of invincibility. It showed that determination, sacrifice, and strategic endurance could reverse even the most powerful advances. From this point forward, the balance of the war slowly began to change. The war reaches its peak. As the war entered its later stages, battles grew even larger and more complex. Amphibious landings brought armies ashore under heavy fire. Paratroopers descended behind enemy lines. Entire regions became battlegrounds as forces pushed toward the heart of enemy territory. Civilians were caught in the middle. Cities were reduced to rubble. Infrastructure collapsed. Yet despite the destruction, these battles were necessary to break the remaining resistance and bring the war closer to an end. Victory at an unimaginable cost. Each major battle of the Second World War carried immense consequences. Some saved nations from defeat. Others accelerated the collapse of entire regimes. All of them came at a terrible human cost. By the time the final battles were fought, the world had been transformed. Borders shifted. Empires fell. New powers emerged. The legacy of these battles shaped military strategy, international politics, and collective memory for generations. The Second World War was not won in a single place, but in countless fields, cities, skies, and seas where millions fought and died. Understanding these battles is essential to understanding the war itself, and this is only the beginning. Part 2. The Battle of Britain and the War at Sea. While armies clashed across Europe, the fate of the war was being decided far from traditional front lines. Above cities and across vast oceans, new forms of warfare emerged, ones that would determine whether nations could survive long enough to fight on. Control of the air and sea became the invisible foundation of every major campaign. The Battle of Britain. Survival from the sky. The first great defensive struggle of the war unfolded in the skies over the British Isles. The Battle of Britain was not an invasion in the traditional sense. It was an attempt to break a nation without setting foot on its soil. Day after day, waves of aircraft crossed the channel. Their targets were airfields, radar stations, factories, and cities. The goal was clear: destroy aerial defenses, cripple industry, and force surrender through exhaustion and fear. Radar changed everything. Early warning allowed defenders to rise only when necessary, conserving strength. Outnumbered pilots fought multiple sorties per day, often returning to battle with damaged aircraft. Victory depended not on overwhelming force, but on timing, coordination, and resilience. When direct attacks on defenses failed, strategy shifted. Bombs fell on urban centers. Night raids turned entire neighborhoods into infernos. Civilians became participants in the war simply by surviving it. Yet instead of breaking morale, the bombing hardened it. Shelters filled. Factories resumed work within hours. The air campaign failed to achieve its objective, marking the first major strategic defeat of the war. Why air superiority mattered. This battle proved a critical truth. Without control of the air, large-scale invasion was impossible. It also demonstrated the growing importance of technology, logistics, and civilian endurance. The sky had become a battlefield, and whoever controlled it would shape the future of warfare. The Atlantic, a war without front lines. While Britain defended itself from above, another, quieter struggle unfolded across the Atlantic Ocean. This was a war of supply, fought thousands of miles from public attention. Merchant ships carried food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials. Without them, armies would collapse without firing a shot. Submarines hunted these lifelines relentlessly, turning open water into a killing zone. The strategy was simple: starve the enemy into submission. Ships vanished overnight. Survivors drifted for days. For years, it seemed the attackers might succeed. Technology versus stealth. Early in the war, underwater attackers held the advantage. They struck silently and disappeared, but innovation slowly shifted the balance. Convoys became better organized. Detection improved. Air patrols extended farther out to sea. What had been an invisible threat became increasingly vulnerable. Losses mounted. The oceans slowly reopened. Control of the sea lanes was restored, not through a single battle, but through thousands of engagements fought in storms, darkness, and isolation. Chandes. The strategic impact. Victory in the air and at sea made everything else possible. It allowed industries to function. It ensured armies could be supplied. It enabled future offensives. It prevented isolation and collapse. Without these victories, later land campaigns would never have occurred. A different kind of courage. These battles were fought not by massed armies, but by small crews, pilots, and sailors operating under constant pressure. Their war lacked clear front lines or dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, it demanded patience, discipline, and endurance. They held the line while the world prepared for what came next. Setting the stage for the turning point. By the time the fighting intensified in the east, the balance had already begun to shift. Airspace was defended. Sea routes were secured. The foundation for eventual victory was in place. What followed would be larger, bloodier, and more decisive than anything before. Part 3. Stalingrad and Kursk, the battles that broke the momentum. The turning point of the Second World War on land came not through a single decision, but through two colossal battles fought on the Eastern Front. Together, they shattered the illusion of invincibility and permanently shifted the balance of power. These were wars of endurance, ideology, and survival, fought in ruins, fields, and fire. Stalingrad, a city that refused to fall. The battle for Stalingrad was not simply a fight for territory. It was a symbolic and strategic confrontation that consumed entire armies. What began as a rapid advance turned into a nightmare of urban combat unlike anything seen before. The city was reduced to rubble by relentless bombardment, yet destruction favored the defenders. Ruins eliminated the advantage of speed and armor, forcing brutal close-quarters combat. Soldiers fought from basements, stairwells, and shattered factories. Front lines shifted by meters, not miles. Winter arrived early and without mercy. Supplies ran low. Hunger and cold killed as efficiently as bullets. Still, the defenders held on, not because victory seemed certain, but because surrender meant annihilation. Then came the encirclement. In a massive counteroffensive, attacking forces struck the exposed flanks and closed the ring around the invaders. An entire army was trapped. Air supply failed. Starvation spread. When surrender finally came, it marked the first total destruction of a major field army in the war. Stalingrad was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological earthquake. The myth of unstoppable advance was gone. From this moment, the strategic initiative began to slip away. The cost of victory. The victory at Stalingrad came at an unimaginable price. Casualties reached into the millions. Entire neighborhoods were erased. Survivors emerged from cellars into a city that barely existed. Yet the meaning of the battle extended far beyond the ruins. It proved that endurance could defeat speed and sacrifice could overcome technology. Morale shifted across continents. For the first time, the aggressor was clearly on the defensive. Kursk, the clash of steel. If Stalingrad broke the momentum, the Battle of Kursk ensured it would never be regained. Here, both sides prepared for the largest armored confrontation in history. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft were assembled for a single decisive blow. Unlike earlier campaigns, there would be no surprise. Everyone knew where and when the attack would come. Defensive lines were constructed in depth. Trenches, minefields, anti-tank positions layered one behind another. When the assault began, attacking forces advanced into a storm of fire. Tanks burned across open fields. The ground shook continuously. At close range, armored units collided in chaotic engagements where speed, visibility, and command structure collapsed. Machines designed for maneuver were reduced to brawling weapons at point-blank range. The end of offensive power. After weeks of fighting, the assault stalled. Losses were catastrophic. Reserve forces were exhausted. When counterattacks followed, the exhausted attackers had no strength left to respond. Kursk marked the final large-scale offensive effort on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the strategic direction was clear and irreversible. The war had entered a new phase, one of relentless retreat. Chest. Why these battles mattered. Stalingrad and Kursk together reshaped the war. They destroyed experienced forces that could never be fully replaced. They transferred initiative permanently. They demonstrated the limits of mechanized warfare. They proved that preparation and defense could defeat aggression. Most importantly, they transformed the psychology of the conflict. Victory no longer seemed inevitable. Defeat no longer seemed impossible. A war decided by endurance. These battles were not won by brilliance alone, but by the ability to absorb suffering and continue. They showed that modern war is not only about movement and firepower, but about will, logistics, and time. After Kursk, the direction of the war was set. The road ahead would be long and brutal, but it now led only one way. But this is only the beginning. The battles you've just seen were the moments when the war changed direction. Yet the most brutal confrontations, the hardest choices, and the final collapse still lie ahead. In the next video, we will continue this journey, exploring the battles that decided the fate of continents and brought the world to the edge of total destruction. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss part 2, because the rest of this story is even more intense.